Um, Welcome to our panel entitled Current Trends in Protest Politics. My name is Jamil Scott, and I'm serving as the chair, and Periloux, Peay is serving as our discussant. This is an exciting slate of papers, and I won't take up too much time because I do want to keep us honest to the hour that we have and leave some room for questions. I will keep time, and so I'm asking that that our panelists keep their presentation to around 10 minutes or so. It's okay. Yeah, around 10 minutes or so, just to be on the safe side, so we have some time for questions at the end and for PA to give some his comments to you all. So I am going to put up a timer in the background, so I'll just share my screen. And so hopefully you'll be able to see my screen as you go through your presentation. But please excuse me if I give a slight hum. Please stop your presentation so we can move on to the next one. All right, so it looks like our first paper on the list is Public Opinion and Political Participation by Adrian Pantoja and Emilio Pantoja. Are those folks here? All right, I don't think they are. So it looks like the next paper on our panel is Secularism and Support for the Black Lives Matter Movement. And our author here is Tammy Greer.
Hi, actually my paper is moving from protest to policy. They put my name with someone else's.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. So if the person that has the other paper about Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, if they're here, they are surely welcome to go, and then I'll go next. No? All right, then. Well, then we're going to do this, right? Okay, Dr. Scott, thank you.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and all right. Okay, and good afternoon, everyone. So I am looking to for a long-term project when it comes to moving from protest to policy and how we can effectively take what we're looking at from the streets and then move it into actual policy. All right, so what is moving from protest to policy? The purpose of my whole project, moving from protest to policy, is just what the name suggests, and that is how we as a community can move from protesting matters, particularly what feels like cyclical matters, how we can move from the actual protesting in the street and move toward policy. This presentation is specifically focused on the methodology that I am using for my overall project. So we can look at policy impact, effectiveness, and what it means to have and move toward sustainability, even though that can seem cyclical. So for my approach from the quantitative side, I am using cases, and I am going to start post 2013. And why post 2013? That is thereabouts the time that Black Lives Matter came into our lexicon. And it's not necessarily focused on Black Lives Matter as an entity. It's just during that particular stage, then there seemed to be more focused on police interaction with communities, and then accountability when it came to police behaviors. Existing databases, there are existing databases, particularly by the Washington Post, Campaign Zero, and the Police Accountability Project that have begun keeping data on this. So I am not going to recreate the wheel. I'm just going to use that. And then particularly the Washington Post seems to keep more detailed information as it pertains to major cities. So I will, use that existing information to see. The unit of analysis I'm using here is I'm calling injury because excessive force does not always lead to death. And so, a person can still have injury, even if it doesn't mean death. So that's a unit of analysis. Of variables I'm using are a policy change and whether or not there's a settlement or whether or not there's a policy change. For a policy standpoint, sometimes there is a policy, yet from a qualitative assessment perspective to determine whether or not there is consequences within policy. Because I argue that a policy without consequence is just a recommendation, and so therefore not an actual policy. And then whether or not the individual, the family, and or the person who was subject to that particular injury, if they received a settlement, and if so, how much. And then when it comes to the dependent variable here, I'm looking to determine whether or not there is a variation and, which cases had a payout, how much was the payout, if there was not a payout, and what were those circumstances surrounding that. From a qualitative perspective, I'm looking here to determine the effectiveness of policy. And what I mean by this is when it comes to the pressure group, whatever that pressure that was put on to whatever municipality or agency, whether or not policy was changed within a year of that pressure group's campaign about a particular lax in policy. From a case comparison standpoint, I am selecting specific pressure groups as to be part of this study and to look within the pressure group, particularly if there's a pressure group such as the NAACP. Over the time of the NAACP, to compare its effectiveness at certain intervals within its existence to determine whether or not there are peaks and valleys in their ability to impact policy. And from the standpoint from a generation, are there different pressure points? Are there different outcomes depending on the generation at the time at that time for the particular group? So what does that mean? That means that, each generation has a responsibility to organize, mobilize, and impact policy, yet certain generations may have more organization, mobilization, and such than other generations. And how does that look as it pertains to policy? So there are other considerations to take, other approaches to take into consideration when it comes to my project, and one of those has to deal with messaging. So there are existing texts about how messaging, communication, and such has an impact on pressure groups. Yet, when it comes to this project, I am not necessarily looking at messages per se as something that is separate. I'm looking at messaging as it pertains to the overall strategy, how legislation can and is created and or introduced, what happens when that particular legislation is passed, if it is, or if it makes it out of committee, and what the courts then do or rule as a result of that particular legislation. And I'm also looking at, when it comes to other considerations, is the zeitgeist when it comes to messaging. Sometimes the zeitgeist has it to where something appears to be a major or at the forefront of people's minds, when in reality it's not. It's a certain group of individuals that are very loud, and that loud group of individuals are putting messages into our brains that don't really exist. From the standpoint of the data, again, the crux of the data that I am using has to do with existing data from the Washington Post, probably in particular, because they have gathered this data very detailed. They even have aggregated the data from the standpoint of how much settlement money has gone to the individuals, whether or not it was excessive force or whatever the charge was against these individuals, and other metrics that they have. One of the other considerations here is that municipalities are not transparent when it comes to such information, because they are not obligated to by law, whether it's state law, and definitely not federal law, because of course, separation of powers under the 10th Amendment. So when it comes to the transparency, particularly as it pertains to disciplinary actions, if any, if a policy was violated, then that would be a challenge for understanding the results when it comes to the project. And then to be clear that, sustainability is not a forever event, that policy is cyclical, and that effectiveness is also cyclical. So the amount of pressure that is put on municipalities, state governments, federal governments, as it pertains to whatever the policy or whatever the pressure group's interests are, can go in these ebbs and flows, especially if the next generation does not put on the same types of pressure in order to have some type of long-term policy change. These are items that are of particular interest when it comes to understanding from, as the conclusion of the project is whether or not some groups, pressure groups, participate in performative activism, or whether it is effective in long-term policy change activism. Whether or not policy change is performative, which means it makes us feel better in the moment, versus it actually having an impact to where there are consequences to some of the behaviors. How counter mobilization can impact whether or not there is, whether or not a policy is changed, whether or not the activism moves from performative to actually being real. And when I in the project, what I mean by real means that the activism is not, we're not protesting for the sake of protesting, that the protesting is part of the first steps to policy change. And if there is no policy change after many different protesting items, what are we asking for? And if we don't have a clear ask as part of the metric for this, then is the activism performative? And then, of course, are there, what are these varying correlations? We've seen in some recent times where, families have received large settlement checks from municipalities, yet we rarely hear any discussion about policy change. So are we having settlements with no policy change? Do we have policy change with no settlements? Do we have policy change and settlements? What does this look like in terms of overall moving the needle forward when it comes to policy? And that's what I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Our next presenter I'm just going to say names since it sounds like the presentations are not associated with the correct title. So our next set of presenters are Leann and Zoe.
Yes. Let me just get our presentation set up. All right. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Leann Mclaren. I'm at Duke University. Me, along with my co-author, Zoe Walker, are going to be discussing our paper today. She's at University of Michigan. And the paper is titled, By Any Means Necessary, The Causal Effects of Protest Exposure on Black Political Attitudes. So much of the motivation for our work comes from the boom of BLM protests during the 2020 start of the pandemic in particular. You know, nationwide, we see all over major US cities, large range of protests happening. And we know that BLM in and of itself did not start in 2020, it started in 2013 as, you know, a viral social media campaign by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. Directly in response to the shooting death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And even with these ranges of protests that did come up in 2020, mainly in response to George Floyd, we again see this large national outcry against police brutality and against these injustices that are happening and becoming more and more publicly aware. But what is interesting about BLM in particular is that in 2020, because it rocked such a lot of the national consensus, we also see the range of the protests that took place nationwide on the ground in these different cities. Anywhere from looting Target to burning police stores, burning police buildings, et cetera, et cetera. The large range of protests that have happened as in response to George Floyd in particular, but also just associated with BLM, had caused a lot of controversy in the media. And our project comes to this sense of we want to know how these protests are essentially affecting Black rank and file political attitudes in particular, as we see that it's largely understudied within political science, how Black people in America actually view the movement in and of itself. So this brings us to our question of what are the political effects of exposure to racial justice protests for Black Americans, and does the type of protest activity matter? So what we know from the literature is, you know, racial identity is largely important to Black political behavior as a psychological resource, and this also applies to the areas of social movements. Much of the work on social movements has focused on the civil rights movement in terms of the protest to politics framework, in terms of seeing the gains from that movement. However, there has been a section of the literature that has focused on the protests that have erupted in the 21st century alongside Occupy Wall Street and such. And a lot of that literature has focused on things like the intersectional frames that BLM has done and that has differed from the civil rights movement. But also a large focus on outgroup attitudes of BLM, specifically among white Americans as it relates to how the race of protesters affects their judgments, how the race of the victim affects their judgments, as well as how a lot of Black political elites in particular have come to critique BLM because it has a lot of fundamental tactics that did not mirror the civil rights movement. And left in all of this literature largely is the voices of rank and file Black Americans, and which is what we want to center in our paper. Essentially, we see here that there may be a large assumption within scholars and media critics alike that Black people just have an overwhelming support for BLM, but we actually find that this is not the case. There's a lot of variation going on here. And the table in front of you, this is from the ANES time series data, where we essentially plotted responses to the question of the extent to which African Americans self-reported physical protest participation. 2000 was the first year that the ANES asked African Americans whether they participated in protests. And we see here that it's actually much lower than we would expect. Only, you know, in 2008, we see the rise this height in terms of the Obama years, but it's only about 25% of the sample that are actually indicating that they're out there on the ground protesting. And then we also see in terms of how Black Americans perceive BLM in particular, data from the 2016 CMPS also shows the type of variation here that we're interested in, where about 30% of the sample doesn't even feel Black BLM is effective, although a large plurality does feel it's somewhat effective. Around 20% feel it's very effective, and then 10% don't even know.
So what we know here is that even though the literature hasn't spent much attention on Black attitudes on BLM, there's still some variation here to explore, and we're interested in that in our experiment in particular. But when we're talking about moderators to how the protest experiments are going to affect several dependent variables of interest, we're looking at two main factors, racial trust and fatigue, as significant moderators to how Black respondents are viewing different types of protests that we vary. We think these factors are important because trust has been generally seen as an important factor in the maintenance of democracy. Shayla Nunley in particular takes serious in her book, Trust in Black America, about how trust, there's a large sense of distrust amongst Black Americans in terms of views of political institutions as well as white out-group members. And we think this is central to how Black Americans are going to view the sustainability of BLM and whether it's effective, as well as other internal and external efficacy factors. And then also factors such as mental fatigue or racial fatigue also come up because with this rise of social media and the constant influx of videos of police brutality amongst Black members, we're interested to see the extent to which this is going to moderate and cause either a mobilizing or demobilizing effect on how Black group members are viewing BLM, its effectiveness, and different measures of efficacy. So this is just a broad picture of our model to where, again, we're arguing that variables of trust in government and racial fatigue are going to be these large moderators to the relationship between the effect of our protest experiments on our outcome measures of interest. And this also leads us to our specific hypotheses, where our first one is we just generally expect that respondents who are exposed to a protest will perceive BLM to be more effective than those who aren't. Our subset of that is that respondents who are exposed to more disruptive protests, i.e. burning or looting, will also perceive BLM to be more effective than those in less disruptive conditions. And then the last two hypotheses are essentially at that moderating relationship that we're interested in, where we think that political trust and racial fatigue will be important moderators to the effect of our treatments generally on our different dependent variables of interest. And with that, I'll take it over to my co-author, Zoe, so she can go more into our experimental design.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for being here. So as Leann already mentioned, we designed an online survey experiment to test our hypotheses. This experiment included 4 conditions, 3 treatment conditions and 1 control. And in each condition, respondents read a fictitious newspaper article that described the police shooting and killing of an unarmed Black man by a white police officer. The story, again, was not true, but was based on realistic events. And the newspaper that we used in our treatment article was also a fictitious newspaper called the St. Louis Daily News. And we can see through the matrix on this slide, just a summary of how we manipulated the level of protest disruption in each condition. So in the control, respondents read an article simply describing the shooting and killing of an unarmed Black man by a white police officer. And in the subsequent articles, we varied choice language to indicate whether or not a protest took place and to what extent that protest involved disruptive tactics. So in the peaceful condition, protesters are simply described as gathering peacefully in response to the shooting. In the looting condition, a group of protesters also participated in stealing food from a nearby grocery store. And in the burning condition, a group of protesters set fire to an empty police headquarters. And in each condition, we made it clear that no one was physically harmed. And again, we tried to keep the language very consistent, only varying what we needed to. And on the next slide, you'll see the text of the article that describes the incident leading up to the shooting was kept the same across all 4 conditions. So to field our experiment, we relied on a small non-representative convenience sample of African-American adults collected through Cloud Research, formerly known as Turk Prime for those who are familiar. All of our respondents self-identified as non-Hispanic, Black, or African-American. And our survey protocol began with pre-test measures for demographics, as well as our moderating variables. Respondents were then randomly assigned to read one of the 4 articles, and they completed a post-test questionnaire, which included our dependent variables. And for our analysis, we just used OLS regressions to estimate average treatment effects for each of our conditions on our dependent variables. And for ease of interpretation, we converted our coefficients to predicted probabilities, which you'll see in the next couple of slides. So first, just to get an overall summary of our results, we're including this table, which is a lot to unpack in the short time that we have here. So we won't be able to get to all of these results. But I will just note that the first column was a straightforward analysis of the main effects of our treatments. So in this model, there were no interactions with our moderating variables. But in the remaining columns 2 through 5, we are looking at interaction effects. So in the next few slides, I will show predicted probability plots to summarize our results in a more accessible way than just that table alone. So our first set of results regards just the main effects of our different treatment conditions. Again, peaceful protesting, looting, and burning on the perception that BLM will be effective at bringing racial equality. And from this plot, we can see that relative to the control condition, across all 3 treatment conditions, respondents were more likely to say that BLM will be effective. Of course, the greatest support for BLM came after the peaceful condition. So respondents in that condition perceived BLM to be the most effective. But the effects of the burning condition were also significant. The looting condition was borderline significant with a p-value of 0.9. So even though it didn't quite reach significance, it still moved in the direction we expected, with exposure to protest generating stronger belief in BLM's effectiveness. Next, we'll just talk a little bit about our the moderating effects of trust on our dependent variables. So for this first plot, we were trying to measure perceptions of group level political efficacy, so the efficacy of African Americans as a group. And so the question we used to measure that asked respondents how often they think that Black people have a say in how the government handles important issues. And we can see from this plot that our treatments had very different effects on respondents depending on how much they reported trusting in the government. So in the burning condition, for example, we see that respondents who were very high on political trust were significantly less likely in the burning condition to say that Black people have a say in how the government handles issues, whereas respondents who were low on political trust were significantly more likely to report that Black people have a say in how the government handles these issues in the burning condition. And the same was true for the peaceful condition as well. And then we also have results for a question, a bit controversial question about the necessity of violence. So this question asked respondents how often they think it is necessary for Black people to use violence to achieve political goals. And again, we see a similar trend where high and low trust respondents have divergent responses to the burning condition. High trust respondents are significantly less likely to say that violence is sometimes necessary, whereas low trust respondents are significantly more likely to say that violence is sometimes necessary in both the burning and the peaceful conditions, although these results are most significant for the burning condition. And again, in the looting condition, we see the responses moving in the same direction, but they weren't significant. And then we also asked respondents about their support for defunding the police. We didn't phrase it that way in the actual survey because the term has become so politicized. We asked them about their support for reducing police budgets to fund social services. And here again, we see that high trust respondents are significantly less likely to support defunding the police in the burning condition, and low trust respondents are significantly more likely to support defunding the police in the burning condition. The results were not significant for any of the other conditions. So for this particular outcome, the burning condition had divergent effects for high and low trust respondents. And just briefly, we'll talk a little bit about our results for racial fatigue. So we measured racial fatigue using 3 novel items that we came up with between the 2 of us. And if you look at the paper, they do appear to be internally coherent and reliable. And they also seem to have some effects on our dependent variables, but only when it comes to questions of internal political efficacy. So from this plot, we can see, consistent with our expectations about racial fatigue, those who report high levels of racial fatigue at the baseline in the control condition are much more likely to say that political issues affecting Black people are too complicated to really understand, whereas respondents who reported very little racial fatigue were much less likely to say that Black politics is too complicated in the control condition. But once we get into our treatments, we see that individuals who are low on racial fatigue were actually more likely to say that Black politics was too complicated when they were exposed to the burning protest condition. And high fatigue respondents were significantly less likely to say that Black politics was too complicated in that condition. So again, this just speaks to the divergent ways that different levels of protest can affect Black respondents, depending on some of these moderating variables like trust and racial fatigue. And that's really the summary of our findings, that the BLM movement is viewed as more effective when it's associated with protests versus when it's not. The type of protest activity does matter. And of course, trust in government and racial fatigue both appear to moderate the effects of this protest exposure. And we'll just end off with our quote here, originally coined by Frantz Fanon, but popularized by Malcolm X in the 1960s. This quote really gets at the heart of the questions that this research project is trying to answer. How do Black people actually feel about the methods and means for acquiring racial justice? And to what extent does Black public opinion tolerate different tactics, particularly more disruptive tactics for achieving that goal? Thank you so much, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you for your presentation. We're going to move on into our next presenter. For our next paper, it is our next presenter rather is Alexander Goodwin. Is Alexander Goodwin here? Okay. I guess we'll go back to our earlier paper. Adrian Pantoja and Emilio Pantoja. Are you folks here? All right. Am I missing anyone? Okay. Well, I guess you could have taken all the time that you wanted for your presentations. I'm sorry about that. All right, well, I'll hand it over to you, Peay, for your comments.
It's all good. Yeah, it leaves a lot of time for Q&A and back and forth, and let's try to work to develop some of these papers and get them published in book projects, like, apparently. Great papers from everybody. I really appreciate the work and time that you put into it. And I'll, for the papers that I received, I will be giving more in-depth feedback and email and stuff like that. So I'm going to leave, just for the sake of time and allowing to open the floor to other comments and questions. I'm going to keep it to like 2 or 3 comments per paper, and then y'all will get the more detailed stuff in a couple of days. First, for the first paper, Dr. Greer, I love the idea. It's close to my heart, this moving from protest to policy. It's definitely tied to the work that I do. So I appreciated the work that you're putting into this, because the nuance of like this transition from civil disobedience or collective action to protest is something that there's a lot of real estate on that needs to be covered. And I know that it's a big project with lots of moving pieces. And I don't know where in the project you are in terms of its development. So I'm just going to keep the comments to more developmental stuff, right? I think, a shameless plug, I think that you should absolutely incorporate some of Dr. Gauss's book, Regina Gauss's book, that she presented yesterday that I was on the panel for, because she's doing something similar to you at the federal level, right? And I think that your contribution of doing things at it appears to be at the local and state level, adds to that conversation. It complements it very well. And her book looks at costly protests, both from two perspectives, right? Like the electoral costs on lawmakers and the costs of those who are protesting and how that varies responsiveness, right? And I think in your instances, I think that type of framework would be helpful in like creating that narrative for you at a local and state level, if that's what you're aiming for. And I also like that you're looking at pressure groups beyond protesters and like organized protesters or disorganized protesters, because there's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot of variance in who's being responded to and how they respond to them. If you look at it through Dr. Gauss's framework, people with more resources are less likely to be viewed, though that the cost of protests are lower, they're less likely to be responsive, or Congress people are a lot more less likely to be responsive. So I think that by incorporating groups like, you know, ACLU or NAACP or any of these like more structured, well-resourced groups, I think that can introduce some variation in who's responding at the local and state level. So let's see. I see that in your presentation, you mentioned that you were focusing on like major cities, and I think there's an opportunity to maybe expand to more rural areas, because that's an untapped resource. It's extremely hard data to get, but like, I think the people that are being abused by police in small cities don't have a real voice. Nobody's focusing on them either in the media accounts or in scholarly accounts. And I think that if there's a way to tap into those areas as sources of data, that might introduce an entire different line of variance in your analysis. Again, because your dependent variable is like payouts in these instances, right? And payouts are typically a function of tax bases and how much resources a state or city might have to pay anyone out. So they're like smaller cities, more rural areas with lower resources might be less inclined to issue payouts to victims of police violence. So that's one reason why I think that it would be a good idea to try to get at least at a 1 or 2 state sample of what it looks like at a rural, less developed area. Let's see. And I'm wondering if the 1-year threshold on policy action happening after a specific protest is too small, because like, of course, as everyone knows, policymaking takes time, and it takes like effort to get things on the agenda. And there might be, you know, things that happen that don't necessarily play out because of whatever political reason. So divided government, you know, partisan bickering, all this stuff, right? So if it might be advantageous to look at it in increments, like so immediate, if something happened within 1 year, but then have another threshold in 3 years and another threshold in 5 years, to see if it's not just if they're responding, but when, how long it takes things to happen, because I think that might play out in some sort of way. I'll leave everything else. If you have the paper to send to me, I'll just I'll give you more comments, and I'm thinking through things as I'm going. So I think I'll leave it at that for that paper. But I really do like it. I would love to talk to you about it, because you know we're in the same city. So like I want to help. I want to see that grow, because there's a lot of promise to it.
Can I give feedback, or you want me to wait?
We have a little time.
Okay,
I don't know how you want to do it, Jamil.
I want to mess up Dr. Scott's flow.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
We totally have all of the time since our other colleagues are not here. So please feel free to respond.
If it's okay, or whatever flow you want to do, just like, okay.
That's fine.
Okay. So I appreciate you very much, because everything you said is one of the things that I'm moving through, and it's actually a book project. So that's where we have the stages. So, okay. So for the pressure groups, so I am incredibly infatuated with conservative pressure groups, because they are amazing. So they have been my like focus, yet I will move more toward the progressive/liberal pressure groups too, to have that as part of it. At the same time, in the project, we'll have conservative groups, and I am trying to make sure that it's not too it is what it's going to be is, because what I've seen in the model to which the end result of the book is a deliverable, right? So there needs to be an action item. And so the action item at the end of the project is because of the effectiveness that conservative groups have that liberal/progressive groups do not. To the point that you made about, is 1 year too short? Maybe we should look at it in 5 years, or 3 years or 5 years. That's part of the stance that liberal groups say, yet conservative groups have the opposite and the audacity to do, and therefore it gets done because it is the moment of which, rather than let them have the tantrum and calm down, and then come a year or the year after, it'll be less involved, as in the other paper. Once everyone's gotten over it emotionally, then we can revisit it. And then when is it ever revisited? So, that's where the year time frame comes in. So I just wanted to, I hear you. I received that. That was a few days of grappling with.
Oh yeah, no, I get you. And I think in that case, if that's the message that you're trying to get across, it might make it even more important to look at how long it takes for things to happen on the liberal progressive side, and then have that comparison point to show how much more effective conservative groups are at getting action items done immediately, right? So that's it. For a different reason, that might actually be a reason to expand it out for some groups to do like more of a survival model type of aspect, to show conservative pressure groups are getting their stuff done in half the time as liberal groups because they have the audacity to do X, Y, and Z, right? So, but I mean, I know that you put a lot of thought into that. And I think that I think it's a great idea, great project. And I like this dichotomy between conservative and liberal pressure groups. And that there's a lot of value added in that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I do want to see where this goes. And yeah, I'm excited.
Thank you.
For the By Any Means Necessary paper, I love it. Like, I love that you're focusing on Black folk. Because like you said, there's so much real estate out there, and there's a whole industry in white identity politics, and there needs to be that same like effort and like love put into the research on Black politics, right? And Black public opinion. Small thing on the front end, I caution against like the analysis of saying like Black people don't report themselves protesting, because if Black people are activists are usually too busy to be being activists than filling out ANES surveys. So that might not be representative of who's participating, because like Black folk that are protesting are atypical people just in general, right? So they're not necessarily, they might not pop in surveys designed to get a representative sample. So by their very nature, they're not that. So I wouldn't lean too heavy in it. Now that might be a point of data that you want to talk about and interrogate why that is the case. But I don't know if in the first reading of the paper that you do that data point justice in examining why that's the case. And it's a small thing. It's on the front end and has no bearing on the overall results of your paper. But I just noticed that on the first read. I find it interesting that the more violent and more peaceful modes of protest are seen as effective, right? Particularly among Black folk. There's work out there that suggests that this isn't the case with everybody. So Black folk see all modes of protest as effective, where only non-Black folk are like, well, you better be peaceful or it's not effective. So I think that's the biggest or a big contribution of your paper. And I think you need to lean in on that, because that is a big data point, particularly when you're focusing on Black folk, that and being able to communicate that, right? Like literally by any means necessary in this instance, right? So a question about well, actually two questions about the second line, the trust and the fatigue aspect of it. In my mind, I would think that people that don't trust government would be more supportive of more violent tactics, but I don't know if that's not what the data suggests, or I might be misreading it. But I would like some commentary on like these might be like counterintuitive findings, because people that have no trust in government might be willing to do whatever, right? The by any means necessary aspect, because they know that the normal means of participation aren't going to be effective. So they might be more inclined to be like, all right, let's burn it down, because they don't trust the government to do what's right. But that's not what your data finds. It finds on all treatments that they have not all of them, but like substantively, they have like a lower trust in their effectiveness. But I don't know if they're all statistically significant, but yeah, I would tease that out a little bit more. And then the other question is just a small clarification question, is like, is the Black politics too complicated to understand actually a part of your fatigue measure, or was this a separate measure, or not in your battery? Because I think they kind of go hand in hand with each other, and I didn't know if that's how y'all were measuring it, but I think they're kind of speaking to the same phenomenon of being tired. Like, I don't even want to deal with trying to figure out what's going on, so this is included in my fatigue. So of course you're going to see correlations with those. So that's what I'm thinking about on that paper right now. And like I said, I'll shoot you all some more detailed comments, some more like as I like to give people like review type of things, but also my thought process as I'm reading your paper and how things are structured. So you'll get that within the next week or so, because I'm on spring break and I ain't got no life. So yeah. Thank you again.
Yeah, I'll just respond real quick to like your first comment, and then Zoe can probably go more into the moderations or the interactions. I think you bring up a good point about like the ANES sample and like the self-reports of the protest activity, because it does call into question like how representative like the surveys are, because especially I guess with the case of like protesting or like just activists, like, you know, if they really are, you know, putting their money where their mouth is, or like doing this stuff, like I guess they wouldn't be expected to be the people that's, you know, getting $5 from getting sampled from ANES. So that would call into question like other data points and such that we would have to look into. But I did think that your point about the fact that Black activists are unique in that tradition in and of itself is an interesting point too. Like, I guess I haven't looked strictly at the data from at least the top of my mind, but it does seem like they would still be a small faction of like less of a faction of the Black community than we would think, which would still kind of support the notion that, you know, if 75% of people aren't protesting, then, you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, I just have to think more about that.
And don't think of that as like, oh, this is like the nail in the coffin of the paper, because it's not. Yeah. It's like a small, very small detail that, I mean, anybody that's doing the survey research would have to grapple with, but it shouldn't be something that derails the project by any means. Please don't take that as my what I'm saying in that point. No,
I think you make a good point, because it's a strong claim to be like less than you think, like, you know, because, you know, I think protesting is a fundamental social tradition in Black politics in the US, you know, but I'll let Zoe chime in for the other part.
Yeah, thank you, PA, for all the comments. It's really helpful for us as we're in the early stages. And regarding like the counterintuitiveness of our results about trust, we did compare a little bit of what we found to CMPS data, which has like huge oversamples of like non-white respondents, especially Black respondents. And they asked the political trust questions, but they also asked how effective people think different methods of protest are at getting the attention of public officials. And they included protest and rioting. And they also asked a general question about the effectiveness of Black Lives Matter. And for all of those like outcomes, except for rioting, high trust respondents thought they were more effective. So high trust respondents actually said that protests were more effective than low trust respondents in the CNPS data. So I don't know quite what to make of this like relationship between like trust and believing that, you know, at baseline protests are more effective, like substantively, but it does seem that empirically it comes up not just in our data, but in CNPS, which is much more representative. And that's still something we want to explore. And we're definitely open to like other literature or ideas that folks might have about why that relationship might be. But I'll also say that we see that, you know, even though the baseline differences in levels of trust and like efficacy are counterintuitive, the effects of the treatments are relatively consistent in that high trust respondents respond to, you know, a violent protest very negatively, and low trust respondents respond to that protest positively. So the effects make sense, but at the baseline, the fact that high trust respondents, you know, for example, are much more likely to say that violence is necessary is like, what's going on there? So yeah, that's just my thought on that.
All right, I will open it up to the audience. It looks like there are already some comments in the chat. So if those folks want to go ahead and chime in, or if folks want to continue the conversation in the chat, that's fine too. We have a good amount of time, y'all. Well, not a good amount of time. We have 10 minutes, just about.
And I wanted to clarify about the rural space. I also received that, and that was another item of interest. And part of it had to do with the transparency component, where because of the, you know, if a state does not require transparency, law enforcement agencies are not going to do it because the municipality does not want them to do it, because there is, you know, the impact of such items. So that's why the rural space was challenging to look at. In the urban space, because they receive more attention, you can get more information. Yet I think long-term, rural spaces, because we do tend to neglect them from a political, social, and economic standpoint, that they should have more attention. It's just the transparency component that has been challenging.
All right, it looks like we have a question from MJ.
Yeah, this is for it's only Leann. I like the paper a lot. I was wondering first, just demographics wise, was there anything about class in there or class differences you guys found, or was this not a variation with like the 250 with that there? And then bigger picture with like the project direction and maybe like if you guys kept going with it, I was wondering, because I love y'all use St. Louis, you know, St. Louis boy, love the love for that. But it was with the by any means necessary, the framing for the experimental design, sort of like not just a shop, but a Black owned shop. Because I'm thinking about, we know with St. Louis, what happened was the moment the Black police officer was killed, that changed the narrative entirely. Because then the Republicans, they then brought that the Black cops family to whatever the RNC convention was that summer, all that there. So it's like the moment is sort of like by any means necessary until it's affecting us and our people. So maybe not even like, you know, a Black person being killed, but when it's a Black owned shop, that's, you know, the one being destroyed, something like that. How does that change the narrative? So yeah, that was it. I have more, but I can't make words for that right now, but I'll text you about it.
Yeah, thanks, MJ. Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially, you know, like you said, St. Louis is like a very Black city. And given that we don't mention that in the like actual treatment, I wonder if people were associating the store with like being Black owned just because of the demographic of St. Louis. So yeah, it's definitely something we'll, even whether we decide to make it Black owned or not, I think it'd be good to like at least make the race of the store or race demographics of the store clear. And yeah, about education or class, we didn't measure income. We did have a measure of education. It didn't seem to have any like interactive effects with our treatments. But of course, we had a really small sample, and like the median education in our sample was some college. So, you know, the accuracy, of course, is up for debate, but we hope to get a larger sample with more representative data in the future.
Yeah, and just like answer your questions about like where we want to take this and like the broader message of like by any means necessary, essentially. I think, you know, reading like Dawson's Black Visions book and really thinking about the different like, you know, attitudes or ideologies that Black Americans may have about the solutions to racial inequality is kind of at the heart of what we're trying to get at. Although we're doing it through protests, just kind of diversifying how, you know, different means or different ways in which we solve racial equality are kind of important factors that we need to dive more into, instead of just assuming that there's just like this general consensus and agreement on fundamental issues that are affecting the Black community. And I think, you know, just from my reading, there really isn't a lot of stuff on like nonviolent protests. What does that even mean? And is that another way for like, you know, people who are not the traditional, you know, middle-class members going through the institutional ways of fighting politics? Are these other avenues that they're considering, and are these going to be effective or like good for the movement? So I think that's like the heart of what we're at. And I do think like collecting more pots of data and really able to measuring more like cross-cutting demographic factors are going to be important moving forward. But yeah, thanks for your comments.
Are there any other questions or thoughts as we come to the end of our panel? All right. Well, I want to thank both presenters for your work. This is really excellent. I really appreciated your presentations, and my apologies for pushing you to finish earlier than you probably could have, given we have additional time. We had additional time, but I really appreciated the work that you put forth, and I wish you the best of luck in moving these projects forward, because this is excellent work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great-
Thank
great
you, Dr.
papers,
Scott
great
and
work.
PA.
Hey, it's all good.
Oh,
I'll be in
please
touch.
feel free to call me Jamil. I put this on here for students so they don't get froggy and leap and call me by my first name.
Fair enough.
Yes.
All right. If there are no more comments, then please enjoy the rest of your conference.
Bye.
Shout out to Jamil. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.